1980. The roar of an explosion shatters the morning silence of a suburb. Walls, built to last for centuries, crumbled in seconds. The 147-room palace, meant to be an eternal monument, vanished. They called it the American Versailles. It was built to prove superiority. But it didn't even stand for 60 years. Today, on its ruins, lawns are mowed in an exclusive gated community. And that is your unexpected connection to the present day. How did a structure, conceived as the ultimate symbol of power, turn into a pile of rubble? To understand how this stone giant died, one must understand the invisible money that gave it birth, and what philosophy moved the hand that signed the check for its creation. Here, in the suburbs of Philadelphia, silence is expensive. Manicured lawns roll one after another. Ancient trees bend over perfect asphalt. This is a world of old money and new rules. But if you look closely, amidst this serene harmony, you can find a scar. There it is. Two massive stone pillars, topped with carved urns. A gate that leads to nowhere. They stand here like orphans, like sentinels who have forgotten what it is they're supposed to guard. Once, they were the grand entrance to a dream. Behind them, on the crest of a hill, stood a palace. Not a house, not a mansion. A palace. 147 rooms under one roof, 45 bathrooms, 24 fireplaces. A facade of Indiana limestone that shone in the sun like the bone of an ancient god. They called it the American Versailles, Whitemarsh Hall. It was built not just of stone and steel. It was carved from pure ambition. It was meant to declare to the world that American power was a new, eternal empire. But empires fall. In the 70s, this ghost palace became a playground for oblivion. Teenagers would sneak inside, leaving their names on the Florentine marble. Broken windows, like empty eye sockets, stared out at overgrown gardens where captains of industry once strolled. The gilding, paid for by monopolies and wars, tarnished under a layer of dust and contempt. The building, created to inspire awe, now evoked only morbid curiosity. Its grandeur had become a backdrop for decay. And then came the end, not quiet and noble, but violent and swift. 1980. The roar of an explosion shattered the morning silence of the suburbs. Dynamite did what time could not. Walls designed to last for centuries collapsed in seconds. The facade, which copied French chateaux, turned into a cloud of limestone dust. The palace, which was meant to be an eternal monument to one man, vanished. How did a structure, conceived as an eternal symbol of power, turn to ruins in less than 60 years? How did the dream of a dynasty become a story of abandonment and demolition? To understand how this stone giant died, one must understand the money that gave it birth, and the philosophy that moved the hand that signed the check for its creation. We imagine the great fortunes of the Gilded Age smelled of oil, like the Rockefellers, or of red-hot steel, like Carnegie's. It was a tangible, understandable wealth, born of earth and fire. But the money that built Whitemarsh Hall had no smell. It was invisible, and for that reason, far more powerful. Its creator's name was Edward Stotesbury. He was not a titan of industry. He was a senior partner in the Philadelphia branch of J.P. Morgan's empire, one of only 20 men admitted to the holy of holies of American capital. They were called the Money Trust. This was no exaggeration. These men didn't just own banks. They owned the very circulatory system of the nation. They decided which corporation to grant a lifeline of credit and which to bleed dry by refusing to finance it. Stotesbury was the hand that rocked the cradle of the American economy. His genius was a genius for organization. In 1901, He helped Morgan orchestrate the merger that created U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. It was financial alchemy. From disparate assets, competition, and rumors, they created a monopoly, and from thin air, a colossal fortune. On that deal alone, their syndicate earned $62.5 million in commission. Today, that's the equivalent of over $2 billion. When Congress summoned Stotesbury for questioning in 1912, accusing the money trust of deliberately creating panic to buy up cheap assets, he maintained an icy contempt. A financial collapse that ruined thousands of people? To him, it was merely a slight misunderstanding. He saw the world not as a society, but as a ledger, and he was the one balancing the debits and credits. And then came the war, the First World War. Even before America entered it, Morgan's bank became the exclusive purchasing agent for Britain and France. Stotesbury and his partners managed a flow of $3 billion directed towards armaments. Their commission, 1%. $30 million in pure profit. Every shell that exploded in the trenches of Europe, every rifle in a soldier's hands, paid for a stone in a future palace in Pennsylvania. This was a new kind of capital. It wasn't earned in a factory or a mine. It was extracted from the control over the movement of money itself. Stotesbury didn't build an empire. He bought and merged the empires of others. His $100 million fortune was an abstraction, woven from stocks, bonds, and power. And now, the man who controlled this invisible force decided it needed a visible, tangible monument. He was going to build something that would prove his power was more real than any steel and more enduring than any stone. Edward Stotesbury didn't need a house. A house is a refuge, a place for family, a safe harbor. He had all that. He needed a monument. His wife, Eva, needed something more. She needed a throne. She was 20 years younger than her husband, ambitious, and hungry for the recognition that the old Philadelphia aristocracy was in no hurry to grant her, an upstart. Whitemarsh Hall wasn't a banker's project. It was the project of a queen in exile who decided to build her own kingdom. Their choice of architectural style, Beaux-Arts, a lavish imperial neoclassicism, was no accident. It wasn't an act of admiration for Europe. It was a challenge thrown down to it, a statement paid for by commissions from war supplies and profits from monopolies that declared, "Everything you built over centuries, we can recreate in 5 years and do it on a grander scale." They weren't going to copy Versailles. They wanted to show that they could buy and build a better Versailles, that American dollars could purchase not just artifacts, but historical legitimacy itself. For this task, they needed a special architect, and they found him, Horace Trumbauer, a self-taught genius with no formal education, but who possessed an instinctive understanding of the language of power. Trumbauer was the perfect weapon for the robber barons. He knew how to transform their abstract wealth into physical, overwhelming dominance. He didn't build homes. He built family headquarters, designed to obliterate any doubt about their owner's greatness with a single glance. He wasn't hired to create comfort. He was hired to design a declaration. Every element of Whitemarsh Hall was a line in this manifesto. The gigantic columns, the symmetrical facade, the enormous grand staircase. None of this was about beauty. It was about order, control, and indestructible power. This palace was meant to shout to the world from its hilltop. The old titles, inherited from your ancestors, are dead. Inheritance means nothing anymore. New money, organized, ruthless, global. That is the true, the only aristocracy. The plan was ready. The money was available. The architect awaited his command. Their declaration of war in stone was written. All that remained was to begin the battle. But they failed to consider that their first opponent would not be an envious society or old Europe, but the very land on which they chose to erect their throne. Before the first stone was laid, before the first blueprint was approved, a war had to be declared. A war not against competitors or hostile nations, but against the land itself, against the hills, farms, and rocks of Pennsylvania. Greatness requires space. And Eva Stotesbury didn't want a mere driveway. She wanted a triumphal path, a 5-mile road that would slowly prepare a guest for the palace's appearance. But people stood in the way of this ambition. Several centuries-old farms, whose lives were governed not by stock market prices, but by the rhythm of the seasons. They were part of this landscape, but to the new world, they were an obstacle. Checks were written. Offers were made that could not be refused. It wasn't a request, but a notification. The old world had to give way. Bulldozers demolished homes that had housed generations. Orchards were uprooted. In their place, a wide, flawless road was laid, a scar leading straight to the heart of the future palace. The first act of violence had been committed, but man was only the first line of defense. The true resistance came from nature. The hill chosen for the construction turned out to be more than just earth. Beneath a thin layer of soil lay hard, monolithic bedrock. The foundation for a giant like Whitemarsh Hall required a deep excavation, and the rock stood its ground. And so began a symphony of destruction. For days on end, the roar of explosions shook the surrounding area. Dynamite shattered what had been created over millions of years. According to the memories of local descendants, the earth trembled for weeks. It was a siege. Each blast was an act of financial will, a demonstration that Stotesbury's capital could crush any obstacle, even a geological one. Nature did not want this palace on its summit, and it had to be subdued by force. Finally, the rock surrendered. Thousands of tons of stone were hauled away. A gaping wound remained in the body of the hill, which they filled with concrete. This wasn't just a foundation. It was a monument to victory. The victory of man over history, of capital over tradition, of dynamite over stone. The beachhead had been seized. The land had been conquered. But to build a palace for a pharaoh, you need an army. And that army had yet to be hired. We see the formal photographs of the palace in its pristine magnificence. The stone shines, the glass gleams, but we almost never see the faces of those who built it. And it was an army summoned not by draft, but by need, drawn to a single point by the almighty power of Edward Stotesbury's capital. There were up to 1,000 of them at any one time, an entire city of workers that sprang up at the foot of the hill. They flocked from all over the world, bringing with them their skills and their desperation. Italian stonemasons, whose fathers and grandfathers had perhaps built palazzos in Florence, now carved ornaments for an American nouveau riche. Every detail that came from under their chisels was paid for, but their soul and centuries of craftsmanship were not listed on the check. Working alongside them were Irish diggers, men whose only capital was the strength of their backs. They dug trenches, hauled stones, and mixed concrete, performing the hardest and most dangerous work for the lowest pay. They were the muscles of this project, the invisible foundation upon which all its ostentatious lightness rested. And of course, the locals, carpenters, electricians, and plumbers from Pennsylvania who found work on the most grandiose construction site the state had ever seen. For them, Whitemarsh Hall was both a blessing and a humiliation. It gave them a wage, but every day it reminded them of the abyss that separated their world from the owners. They were building a paradise they would never be allowed to enter. The walls they were building were not just an architectural element. They were a physical border between two universes. They polished marble floors their children would never run across. They installed crystal chandeliers whose light would never illuminate their family dinners. Every hammer blow, every driven nail, increased the distance between the creator and the creation. This wasn't malice. It was the simple, brutal economics of the Gilded Age. Human labor was a resource just like limestone or steel, to be bought as cheaply as possible and used as efficiently as possible. The palace's skeleton grew, stone by stone, floor by floor, embodying the will of one man. But across the ocean, a storm was already gathering, one that could turn not only armies of men to dust, but also the most audacious ambitions of financiers. In Edward Stotesbury's world, everything could be calculated, organized, and bought. Labor, materials, even the land itself, they were all just lines in the ledger of his ambition. The construction of his palace proceeded on schedule, subject to an iron will and an unlimited budget. But in April of 1917, a sound arose in the world that was louder than the clang of steel and the crash of hammers on the construction site. It was the sound of America entering the First World War. The reality that Stotesbury had kept at bay for so long with his millions invaded without an invitation, and it demanded its share. The steel intended for the roof of his ballroom was now needed to build destroyers, the copper for the wiring, to manufacture shell casings, and most importantly, the people. The very army of 1,000 workers that had been erecting the walls of his fantasy was now needed by the nation to build army camps, factories, and to fill the ranks of the actual army. Construction stopped, not on the owner's command, but at the behest of history. The crew was disbanded, the machinery fell silent, and on the hilltop, above the conquered rock and the raised farms, stood a colossal skeleton of stone and concrete, a ghost that had not yet been born. It stared out at the world through empty window openings like an ancient ruin that had appeared overnight. This unfinished palace became the era's most inconvenient monument, a monument to misplaced ambition in a world consumed by fire. It was the embodiment of the idea that personal greatness was more important than a global catastrophe. For Stotesbury, it was a humiliation. His will, capable of moving markets and crushing competitors, was powerless against a mobilization order. This was the first crack in the idea of eternity, the first brutal reminder that no man, no matter how rich, can build a fortress that the real world cannot breach. His palace, conceived as a challenge to history, had itself become its hostage, frozen in wait, while the great slaughter on the other side of the world decided its fate. When the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent, the hammers in Pennsylvania began to sound again. The war that had halted construction now became its greatest resource. It left behind a bankrupt continent whose treasures had become assets for sale. And for Eva Stotesbury, mistress of the unfinished palace, this was a signal to act. An operation without precedent began. This wasn't just shopping, it was a hunt. An operation to transplant the soul of the old world into the body of the new. It was an act of cultural cannibalism. Stotesbury's agents, armed with checkbooks, scoured post-war Europe like vultures. Their targets weren't just antique chairs or paintings. Their target was the very fabric of history. They entered castles and estates whose owners, aristocrats with centuries-old bloodlines, had been ruined by inflation and war. And they bought everything. Not an object, an entire room. Imagine a ballroom from an 18th century French chateau. Its parquet floors remember the footsteps of marquises. Its carved panels have overheard courtly intrigues. Expert craftsmen, like surgeons, carefully disassembled it piece by piece. Every panel, every scroll of molding, every floorboard was marked, crated, and shipped across the Atlantic. And then, thousands of miles from its homeland, it was reassembled, like a giant, expensive puzzle, in the heart of an American mansion. This was not the preservation of heritage. It was its abduction. Fireplaces that had warmed generations of dukes were torn from the walls and installed in Pennsylvania to heat a banker's drawing rooms. Tapestries that for centuries had told stories of battles and myths were stripped from the walls of European palaces to muffle the echoes in American corridors. Whitemarsh Hall wasn't simply being decorated. It was feeding on the history of others. Every object within its walls was bought with someone else's sorrow. Every room was a trophy captured in a bloodless but brutal financial war. The ghosts of European aristocracy now lived inside the palace, whispering in a foreign tongue. The interiors were complete, but outside, beyond the enormous windows, stretched a naked, wounded land, still bearing the scars of explosions. The palace was a body with a borrowed soul, but without its own skin. And that skin had yet to be created. From scratch. A palace built to look old could not stand in the middle of young, untouched land. It would have violated the entire logic of the project. Eva Stotesbury understood. Greatness needs context. And if you don't have centuries of history, you have to buy it. Immediately. For this task, Jacques Grébert was brought in, a French landscape architect, a man accustomed to working with royal gardens and the parks of the Élysée Palace. His mission was not simply to plant a garden. His mission was to commit a deception of time. He was to create on 300 acres of Pennsylvanian land the illusion that this park had already existed for centuries. But gardens, like dynasties, take time to grow. Young saplings would have looked pathetic against the monumental facade. Waiting decades for the trees to reach the required height was unthinkable for Eva. She wanted history right now, ready-made. And so a decision was made that, even today, is stunning in its audacity and scale. An unprecedented logistical operation began. Across the country, agents sought and bought not saplings, but fully grown mature trees. Enormous maples, oaks, and lindens, some 50, even 70 years old. They were carefully excavated with a giant root ball to avoid damaging the roots. Specially designed flatbeds loaded them onto trains and transported them for hundreds of miles to Pennsylvania. It was like the migration of forest giants. Dozens, hundreds of adult trees arrived at the construction site like captured generals. They were planted in pre-prepared locations, creating instant avenues and groves. In the morning, it was an empty field. By evening, a centuries-old forest was rustling. This was an attempt to buy not just a plant, but the shadow it casts, to buy the rustle of leaves that remember generations. Each of these trees, torn from its native soil, was a symbol of the Whitemarsh Hall philosophy. Why wait when you can pay? Why grow when you can transplant? This wasn't a garden. It was a stage set, assembled from living, but foreign, elements. The palace had acquired its park. It was born an adult, with no childhood, no youth, no organic growth, just like the fortune that created it. Luxury is the illusion of effortlessness. It's a world where food appears on the table by itself, where fireplaces are lit before you feel a chill, where dirty dishes vanish and the bed is always impeccable. At Whitemarsh Hall, this illusion was perfected, and to maintain it, the architect Horace Trumbauer created a parallel universe, a world hidden behind the walls. Imagine we dissect this house like in an anatomical theater. We see the grand halls, the enormous bedrooms, the library. But between them, inside the thick walls, like veins and arteries, runs a complex network of invisible corridors, secret staircases, and service elevators. This was the palace's nervous system. Along it moved an army of 40 household staff, silent and unseen. They were ghosts in their own reality. A maid could clean a bedroom, change the linens, and disappear through a hidden door in the wall without ever meeting the owners. A footman could deliver drinks to the smoking room, appearing from nowhere and dissolving into a paneled wall. Their world was one of narrow passages, steep stairs, and the dim light of electric bulbs. Their job was to be efficient and invisible. This hidden house was as meticulously planned as the formal one. The basement floor housed restaurant-sized kitchens, laundries, pantries, and staff rooms. From there, service elevators carried food and clean towels to all 5 floors. This system allowed the 147 rooms to be serviced with clockwork precision, creating for the guests and owners the feeling that the house lived and breathed on its own, anticipating their every desire. The existence of 2 worlds under one roof was not just a convenience. It was a social philosophy cast in concrete. There were those who lived on stage and those who worked backstage, and these 2 worlds were never meant to intersect. The hidden corridors were the architectural embodiment of the invisible hand of the market that makes the lives of the rich comfortable. The servants were functional elements, just like the plumbing or the electricity. They had to work flawlessly and remain out of sight. They were living mechanisms, upholding the illusion that greatness requires no effort. Whitemarsh Hall was dressed in historical garments, French neoclassicism, English Georgian style. But beneath this powdered mask beat the heart of the American 20th century. A heart of steel, copper, and electricity. It was not just a house, it was a machine, a high-tech fortress designed to demonstrate not only the cultural, but also the engineering superiority of the New World. European castles could boast of tapestries and ghosts, but they were drafty and had primitive plumbing. Stotesbury was building something different. His palace was an autonomous organism, an embodiment of the American belief in progress and efficiency. In its depths hummed its own telephone exchange, servicing 40 internal lines. Any guest could, without leaving their bedroom, contact the library, the kitchen, or the garage. It was a private communications network, a small empire of communication within a financial empire. Forget about brooms and dustpans. A central vacuum system was built into the walls. In every room, there was a special outlet where a maid would connect a hose, and all the dust and debris were carried away through a network of hidden pipes to a central collector in the basement. The house breathed cleanliness, maintained by invisible technology. The kitchens were equipped not just with refrigerators, but with industrial walk-in coolers, capable of storing provisions for a banquet of hundreds. Elevators glided silently between the 5 floors, eliminating the need to use the endless staircases. Its own power plant and water purification system made the estate completely independent of the outside world. It was a declaration of self-sufficiency. Each of these systems was not merely a convenience. It was a statement that American engineering ingenuity could create a level of comfort and control unattainable by the European aristocracy with their centuries-old, yet inefficient, castles. Whitemarsh Hall was a hybrid. On the outside, it spoke the language of the past, the language of Versailles and Imperial Rome. But on the inside, it spoke the language of the future, the language of Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, and total automation. It was a machine for living, created to serve the gods of a new industrial Olympus. At the very heart of this palace machine, in the vast main hall, stood something that went beyond mere comfort or a display of technology. It was an altar, the central symbol of the entire house. A giant Aeolian organ, one of the largest private organs ever built in the world. Its cost, $120,000 in 1921, was equivalent to the price of an entire city block of ordinary houses. Thousands of pipes, from tiny ones the size of a pencil to enormous ones several stories high, were hidden behind carved panels and tapestries. They were the lungs of this house, capable of filling its space with sound, from the barely audible whisper of a flute to a deafening roar that shook the marble floors. This was not just a musical instrument. It was an incredibly complex mechanism, created for the listening pleasure of one single man. Every day, Edward Stotesbury would come down for breakfast, and at that moment, on an unseen signal, the resident organist, seated at a console on the floor above, would begin to play. Picture the scene. A banker, whose fortune was built on controlling financial flows, sits alone or with his wife at a table in a hall that could accommodate 100 guests. And all around him, pouring from the very walls, is the music of Bach or Wagner, performed personally for him. It was a daily ritual that affirmed his status. He was not just a listener. He was the patron, the sole audience in this personal cathedral. Power is not just seeing your greatness in mirrors and marble. Power is hearing it. Hearing the most complex and expensive instrument in the world play on your schedule. This organ was the voice of Whitemarsh Hall. It did not entertain. It proclaimed. Every note resonating in the empty hall was part of a symphony of absolute, total power. A symphony written for a single listener who believed this music would play forever. 1921. 5 years of construction, millions of dollars, tons of blasted rock, an army of workers, and a fleet of ships laden with European history. All of it was in the past. The machine had been assembled. The declaration in stone was complete. The Stotesbury family moved into their palace. It was the perfect moment. America had just emerged victorious from the First World War, transforming from a debtor into the planet's main creditor. Old Europe lay in ruins, and across the ocean, an era of unrestrained optimism and dizzying wealth was beginning. The Roaring Twenties, an era of jazz, bobbed hair, and endlessly rising stock prices, and Whitemarsh Hall was ready to become its main stage. The gates that today lead to nowhere swung open then for the first time to admit the new American elite. The first cars, Packards, Cadillacs, Duesenbergs, moved slowly up the 5-mile driveway. Every turn was choreographed to heighten the anticipation. At first, a guest would see only glimpses of the roof through mature, ancient trees. Then, around the final bend, the entire facade would suddenly appear before them. Vast, symmetrical, radiant. The effect was calculated to elicit a single gasp, a gasp of awe. The palace was alive. Light poured from hundreds of windows. The sounds of the organ mingled with the laughter of guests. A staff of 40 servants and 70 gardeners worked as a single invisible mechanism. Eva Stotesbury had finally ascended to her throne. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, greeting guests, and in that moment, she was the queen, not just of a house, but of an entire era. Everything worked. The money invested in this project had transformed into the very thing it was all for: undeniable, tangible, overwhelming status. The dream had come true. The American Versailles was complete and ready to receive its gods. They had ascended their Olympus, confident that their reign would be eternal, not noticing that the foundation of this Olympus was already built on a volcano. The era of parties had begun. Whitemarsh Hall was roaring. Its halls, designed for receptions, were finally fulfilling their purpose. The most spectacular event was the debutante ball for Eva's daughter, Louise, in 1924. 800 guests, an orchestra that played until dawn, champagne that seemed to flow from the fountains themselves. Everyone was there. Henry Ford, top executives from General Motors, foreign dignitaries, and even Queen Marie of Romania. The house became a stage on which a play called Success was performed. But behind the glittering facade, in the silence of the vast rooms, lay an emptiness. This palace was a perfect instrument for demonstrating power, but it proved to be completely unsuitable for living. It was not a family fortress, but a public space, like a luxurious hotel, where its owners were merely the most important guests. Edward Stotesbury, the man who had paid for all this splendor, often felt like a stranger at his own parties. While music blared and glasses clinked below, he would often retreat to his study, immersed in a world of figures and reports. He was the creator of this world, but not a part of it. His true passion remained his work, that invisible empire of capital he continued to build. The house was merely its physical, but lifeless embodiment. His own children from his first marriage hated the place. They called it the cave, the mausoleum. To them, it was not a family nest, but a cold, oppressive monument to their stepmother's ambitions. They visited rarely, as if performing a duty, and sought to leave as quickly as possible. The house that was meant to be the cradle of a dynasty was rejected by those who were meant to continue it. Whitemarsh Hall was a gilded cage, perfectly constructed, flawlessly finished, but a cage nonetheless. It was built for the public, for magazine photographers, for envious gazes. It was a machine for producing an impression, not happiness. And its master, sitting in his study to the sounds of his personal organ, was perhaps the loneliest man in that entire vast, echoing space. He had built himself an Olympus, only to discover that at its summit there was no one to talk to. October 1929. In the ballroom of Whitemarsh Hall, the echo of the last reception had not yet faded. But on Wall Street, a very different kind of music was already playing. The clatter of ticker tape machines, punching out numbers on the tape that fell and fell and fell without stopping. This was the sound that began the Great Depression, the sound that became the funeral march for the entire Gilded Age. For Edward Stotesbury, a man whose fortune was woven from stocks and bonds, it was a catastrophe. His invisible empire, built on the faith in endless growth, was crumbling before his very eyes. The wealth that had seemed as solid as the walls of his palace was evaporating, turning into worthless scraps of paper. And almost immediately, a silence fell over Whitemarsh Hall. A long, oppressive silence. The music stopped. The enormous chandeliers were no longer lit in the evenings. The receptions ceased. The doors were closed to guests. Most of the staff, gardeners, footmen, maids, cooks, were dismissed. The army that had maintained the illusion of ease was disbanded, no longer needed. The gardens, born fully grown, began to run wild. The fountains ran dry. The vast rooms were closed off one by one, covered in dust sheets, and plunged into darkness. The house, which had been a machine for living, turned into a gigantic, cold mechanism, stopped in its tracks. Stotesbury himself, his health failing along with his fortune, found himself trapped in his own creation. Confined to a wheelchair, he spent his days in a single heated room to save on coal. From its window, He looked out at the empty avenues and overgrown lawns, at the ruins of his dream. The palace that was meant to be his triumph became his mausoleum. It died long before its creator did. When Edward Stotesbury died in 1938, it changed nothing. His death was not the cause of the decline, but its logical conclusion. The man was dead, but the house, like a living organism, had died much earlier. It died on the very day the financial bubble that gave it life had burst. The era was over, and its most grandiose monument was wanted by no one. The earth had barely settled on Edward Stotesbury's grave when his widow, Eva, did something no one expected of the queen of this palace. She left it, immediately, without sentiment. The house that had been her throne had overnight become her prison, a monument to lost wealth and exorbitant expenses. She tried to sell it, for $1 million, but there were no buyers. The world had changed. In the midst of the Great Depression and on the brink of a new world war, who would want to buy a symbol of a collapsed, despised era? The annual tax of $47,000 was a death sentence for any budget. The palace became a white elephant of epic proportions. And then, in 1944, the dismemberment began. An auction. Everything that had been so greedily collected from all over Europe was now going under the hammer. French paneling, bought from the ruins of the aristocracy, was now sold for a pittance to building contractors. Tapestries that had cost a fortune went for 1/100th of their price. The soul of the house, composed of dozens of other souls, was sold off piece by piece. Stripped of its contents, the house became just a body, and the desecration began. For decades, it stood abandoned, like a giant skeleton on a hill. Vandals tore up the parquet floors, smashed priceless mirrors, and spray-painted graffiti on marble walls that once reflected the light of diamonds. The sound of shattering glass became the new music in its empty halls. The building, created to inspire awe, now became a grim attraction. Its death warrant was signed in 1980, but even dying proved difficult for this giant. The walls, built to withstand centuries, did not yield to bulldozers. The structure was so solid that it had to be blown up with dynamite. The last sound Whitemarsh Hall ever made was not the sound of an organ, but the roar of an explosion. It did not go quietly, but with a rage, clinging to the earth to the very last. In its place, on land fertilized with the dust of the palace, an exclusive housing development grew. It was given an ironic name, Stonehenge, the Stone Age. Today, children play here, and on weekends, lawns are mowed, and only sometimes in the background, you can see one of the surviving columns, rooted in the earth like an ancient megalith. It stands not as a memory of greatness, it stands as a warning against arrogance. Whitemarsh Hall did not survive because it was built not on a cultural foundation, but on a bubble of financial speculation. And when the bubble burst, the illusion vanished. The story of this palace of stone and dust leaves us with one question. Can a legacy, bought with money but devoid of roots, outlive the brief, glittering era that created it? The story of Whitemarsh Hall is not a tale of stone and marble. It is a parable about the attempt to transform the invisible, abstract power of money into something eternal and tangible, to build a dynasty on the foundation of a financial bubble. But when the bubble burst, it turned out that this stone giant was merely a stage set, magnificent, but empty, without roots in culture or human connection. And the main question it leaves behind, etched in the air where it once stood, is this: what truly creates a legacy? A colossal fortune capable of buying and recreating the past, or time itself, which can neither be bought nor accelerated. we have told this story. Now, we invite you to a dialogue. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let the echo of this fallen palace resound in your reflections. Your subscription and support will help us continue to tell stories that make us look to the past to better understand the present.